The plaza outside the state's most closely watched courthouse carried a quiet tension, the kind that settles just before something irreversible takes shape. Reporters from 3 networks had already claimed positions along the marble steps. Cameras on tripods lined the plaza like silent sentinels. Inside the building, clerks moved through hallways with stacks of files, and security officers checked badges twice instead of once, sensing the unusual weight of the moment. Outside, traffic crawled past the barricades as onlookers slowed simply to watch the growing crowd. Then, a deep, smooth engine note rolled into the plaza, almost gliding rather than driving. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom eased to a stop directly in front of the courthouse entrance. Its paint caught the light in a way that turned several heads at once. For a moment, the plaza seemed to hold its breath, uncertain whether a celebrity or a politician had arrived. The driver's door opened first, but it was the passenger door that drew every eye. The woman who stepped out moved with the unhurried calm of someone who had never once needed to explain herself. She wore a charcoal suit, simple and tailored, with no logos and nothing that asked for attention. Her name was Lila Monroe, a federal judge known across the legal community for 2 qualities above all others: an unshakable sense of fairness and a silence that unsettled people far more than shouting ever could. Very few outside her closest circle knew the car belonged entirely to her, purchased with savings built over 2 decades of discipline, not gifted, not borrowed, not stolen. She had grown up in a small house with a single bedroom shared among 3 sisters, and she had built every part of her life one deliberate decision at a time. None of that history was visible to the man watching her from across the plaza. Patrol Officer Travis Kane saw only a woman, a luxury car, and a set of assumptions that had already hardened in his mind before she had taken 3 steps. He had been on the force for 11 years, respected by some colleagues and quietly avoided by others who had learned to keep their distance from his temper. He leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed, watching Lila walk toward the courthouse steps as his expression shifted from curiosity to something colder. "No way that is her car," he muttered to the officer standing beside him, loud enough for 2 nearby bystanders to hear every word. His partner, a younger officer named Devin Hale, glanced at the vehicle and then back at Kane, unsure why the comment carried so much certainty. In Kane's mind, an equation had already solved itself without evidence, without registration, without a single fact beyond what his eyes had decided to believe. A woman who was black, driving a car worth more than most people earned in 5 years. To him, the math did not need checking. The conclusion had arrived before the question had even been asked. He pushed off from his cruiser and began walking toward her with the deliberate stride of someone who believed he was about to uncover something important. A few feet away, a group of attorneys waiting for the session noticed the change in his posture. One of them, a younger woman holding a leather folder, slowed her pace just enough to watch. Something about the way Kane approached, chest forward, jaw tight, told her this was not a routine check. The plaza, already crowded with reporters, clerks, and curious onlookers, shifted its attention all at once toward the black car and the woman standing calmly beside it. Nobody in that crowd yet understood who she was, but everyone could sense that something uncomfortable was about to unfold in plain daylight. Kane reached her within seconds, positioning himself just close enough to assert authority without technically crossing into hostility, a tactic he had used countless times before. "Ma'am," he said, "I need to see your license, your registration, and proof of insurance right now." Lila did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She did not even shift her expression beyond a calm, practiced patience that came from decades spent inside courtrooms, far harsher than any sidewalk confrontation. She reached into her bag with slow, deliberate movements, fully aware that sudden motion could be misread, and handed him exactly what he asked for without a single word of protest. Kane studied the documents the way a man studies something he has already decided is fake, flipping the registration card over twice, holding the license up to the light as though searching for a flaw that did not exist. "People fake papers every day," he said flatly, more to the gathering crowd than to her. Lila's expression remained unreadable, though something behind her eyes suggested she had seen this exact pattern play out before, in different rooms, with different uniforms, but always with the same underlying assumption. "The documents are accurate, officer," she said and waited. Devin Hale, standing a few steps behind his partner, leaned in and lowered his voice. "It looks legitimate, Kane," he said carefully, trying to diffuse the tension before it grew teeth. Kane ignored him entirely. His attention narrowed instead on proving a theory that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with the story he had already built inside his head. He needed her to be guilty of something, anything, because the alternative meant admitting his first instinct had been wrong, and men like Kane rarely allowed themselves that kind of admission in public. The small crowd nearby had grown thicker, drawn by the universal human curiosity that gathers wherever conflict seems to be brewing. A retired teacher walking her dog paused at the edge of the plaza, phone already lifting halfway from her pocket. Two court clerks on a smoke break exchanged a glance that needed no translation, the kind of look people share when they recognize a familiar injustice taking shape in front of them. Even the reporters who had arrived for an entirely different story began glancing sideways, sensing that something far more immediate might be unfolding right there on the steps. Lila remained still, her composure unshaken despite the rising tension around her, because she understood something Kane did not yet grasp, that patience often outlasts power. She had built an entire career on the principle that calm authority speaks louder than panic ever could, and she intended to let that principle carry her through whatever came next. Kane, however, seemed to mistake her stillness for weakness, doubling down with each passing second, as though raising his voice might somehow manufacture the guilt he was determined to find. "You understand I can have this car impounded right now," he said, his tone sharpening, daring her to react. Lila met his eyes directly for the first time since the confrontation began, her voice low and even. "You're welcome to call it in, but I'd advise you to verify everything first." The certainty in those words landed harder than any protest could have, because it was the calm of someone who already knew, with complete confidence, exactly how this would end. By now, the gathering crowd had stopped pretending to mind their own business, drifting closer in small clusters along the courthouse steps. Kane ordered Lila to step away from the vehicle entirely, his voice carrying across the plaza with a sharpness that turned even more heads. She complied without resistance, moving exactly as instructed, her hands visible, her posture relaxed in a way that seemed almost designed to highlight just how unnecessary his aggression truly was. Among the onlookers, a tall man in a gray suit suddenly stiffened, recognition flashing across his face the moment he got a clear look at her. He was an attorney who had appeared before Lila's courtroom on more than one occasion, and the sight of her standing in handcuff range stunned him into a brief frozen silence. He leaned toward the colleague beside him and whispered just loud enough to be heard by 2 or 3 nearby strangers. "That is Judge Monroe." The words rippled outward in a slow wave, passed from one mouth to another until a noticeable shift moved through the crowd, an unmistakable tension that came from realizing exactly how wrong this entire scene had become. Kane either did not hear the warning or chose to dismiss it entirely, too committed to his version of events to allow new information to interrupt it. "I do not care who she says she is," he snapped, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear with painful clarity. The statement landed like a small explosion across the plaza because Lila had said nothing about her title, had not once raised her position as a shield, and yet Kane had already decided that any claim to credibility from her had to be a lie. More phones rose into the air. A young man recording from the courthouse steps adjusted his angle to capture both Kane and Lila in the same frame, narrating quietly under his breath for an audience he had not yet gathered but somehow already sensed would exist. A live stream blinked into existence on a small screen held by a college student near the barricades. The little red icon glowed as though marking the exact second history decided to take notice. Within moments, dozens of strangers were no longer just watching. They were broadcasting, turning a quiet sidewalk encounter into something the city would not be able to ignore. The pressure in the air thickened with every passing second. Not loud, not violent, but heavy in the way silence becomes heavy right before a storm breaks. Lila remained motionless, watching Kane with an expression that held no fear, only a kind of patient disappointment, the look of someone who has seen this story before and already knows exactly how foolish the ending will appear once the truth comes out. Kane, sensing the crowd's mood shifting against him, seemed to grow even more determined to assert control, mistaking the rising tension as a reason to escalate rather than a warning to stop. Somewhere near the edge of the plaza, a court security officer radioed in a brief, cautious message, alerting his supervisor that something unusual was unfolding outside, though he chose his words carefully, unsure yet of how serious the situation truly was. Inside the courthouse, clerks glanced toward the windows, drawn by the commotion building outside the very walls where order was supposed to be sacred. The contradiction was not lost on anyone watching closely. A system built to deliver justice fairly was now standing witness to the opposite happening right outside its own front doors. Kane reached for his handcuffs. The metallic click of the restraint mechanism cut through the noise of the crowd like a small, sharp warning. The plaza seemed to freeze entirely in that instant, voices dropping into stunned silence as though everyone present understood almost simultaneously that a line had just been crossed that could not be uncrossed. A nearby attorney stepped forward instinctively, raising a hand in protest. "Officer, this is unnecessary," she said firmly, her voice carrying clear authority despite the chaos surrounding her. Kane turned toward her sharply. "Back up, ma'am, or you'll be detained too." The attorney hesitated, torn between her instinct to intervene and the very real fear of becoming another headline herself. Lila, sensing the tension rippling outward, spoke calmly, her voice steady enough to cut through the noise without ever rising in volume. "It's all right, let him finish what he started." The cuffs closed around her wrists with a soft metallic snap that somehow sounded louder than anything else happening in that crowded plaza. Lila did not resist, did not pull away, did not offer the slightest gesture of struggle, because she understood, perhaps better than anyone present, that her composure in this moment would matter far more than any argument she could make. "You'll regret making assumptions," she said quietly, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty she might have used announcing a verdict. Kane laughed, a short, dismissive sound meant to project confidence he no longer fully possessed. "I'm just doing my job," he said, glancing toward the gathered onlookers as though seeking approval that was clearly not coming. Instead, the crowd's energy had shifted entirely. No longer curious bystanders, but something closer to witnesses. Eyes hardened. Expressions tightened with a quiet, collective outrage that had been building steadily since the first accusation. Several people shook their heads. One woman muttered something under her breath about disgrace. Another simply lowered her phone for a moment, as if she could not bear to keep filming, only to raise it again seconds later, determined that this moment needed to be documented no matter how uncomfortable it felt. Word moved through the crowd like electricity now. The name Judge Monroe passed from person to person with increasing urgency, each repetition adding weight to the realization that this was not simply an officer doing his duty, but something far more troubling unfolding in full public view. A reporter who had arrived to cover an entirely unrelated trial suddenly found herself holding a story far larger than anything on her original assignment sheet. She began typing rapidly into her phone, capturing details before they slipped from memory, aware that whatever was happening here would not stay contained to this small courthouse plaza for long. The footage spreading online captured every second with brutal clarity. The calm woman in handcuffs, the officer standing over her with visible satisfaction, the documents he had dismissed without proper review lying forgotten in his own hand. Viewers far beyond the plaza were beginning to watch in real time, drawn by the unmistakable tension visible even through a small phone screen. Somewhere across the city, in offices far removed from those courthouse steps, certain phones had already begun to buzz with urgent, unexpected messages. With her wrists restrained and her composure entirely intact, Lila turned her head slightly toward Kane and asked quietly but firmly for permission to make a single phone call. Kane, perhaps sensing an opportunity to look reasonable in front of the growing crowd, allowed it, gesturing for another officer to hold the phone steady against her ear since her hands remained cuffed behind her. The plaza grew quieter, almost unnaturally so, as if everyone present understood instinctively that whatever happened in the next few seconds would matter far more than anything that had come before. "This is Judge Monroe," she said, her voice steady, measured, utterly without panic. "I need immediate assistance." A brief pause followed, the kind of silence that stretches longer than its actual length because of the weight pressing down on it. From the other end of the line, a voice replied simply, "I understand." Nothing more, no explanation, no raised tone, no lengthy instructions, just two words delivered with the calm certainty of someone who already knew exactly what needed to happen next. The call ended almost as quickly as it began. Kane, watching the brief exchange with visible amusement, could not resist a small laugh. "That's your big move," he said, shaking his head as though confirming his own theory that her composure had been nothing more than empty bluffing all along. Several officers nearby exchanged uncertain glances, sensing something in Lila's expression that did not match the mockery being directed at her or me. She did not respond to his comment, did not defend herself, did not explain who she had called or why. Instead, she simply waited, her posture unchanged, her breathing calm, an expression of quiet, unwavering patience settled across her face like someone watching dominoes she had already arranged begin their inevitable fall. The crowd, sensing something building beneath the surface, grew increasingly restless. Phones still raised, voices hushed, attention locked entirely on the courthouse steps where the next chapter of this story seemed about to begin. Devin Hale shifted uncomfortably beside his cruiser, glancing repeatedly toward the street as though anticipating something neither he nor Kane could yet fully see coming. A court security guard standing near the entrance lowered his radio slightly, listening intently to a transmission that had suddenly grown more urgent in tone. Whatever message had traveled through that brief, quiet phone call, it was already moving through channels far beyond what anyone standing in that plaza could observe directly. Far across the city, inside offices connected by secure lines and rapid communication networks, a chain of urgent calls had begun the moment Lila's voice reached the right ears. Names were exchanged, instructions issued, vehicles dispatched. The wheels of an entire system, often slow and bureaucratic under ordinary circumstances, had suddenly found a reason to move with extraordinary speed, propelled by a quiet certainty among those receiving the call that delay was simply not an option. In one office overlooking the river, a deputy chief set down his coffee mid-sip the moment the name on his screen registered, abandoning the meeting he had been chairing without a single word of explanation. In another building entirely, a federal marshal was already reaching for his car keys before his supervisor had finished the sentence. The kind of instinctive urgency reserved for situations that allow no margin for hesitation. Calls layered upon calls, each one shorter than the last, until the entire apparatus of accountability that normally moved through paperwork and procedure instead moved through instinct, recognition, and a shared unspoken understanding of exactly how serious this had already become. The plaza outside the courthouse transformed entirely, the quiet tension of moments earlier shattered by a convoy of vehicles arriving in rapid, coordinated succession. Black sedans pulled up alongside marked patrol cars, doors opening almost simultaneously as figures in suits and uniforms stepped out with the kind of urgency that immediately silenced the murmuring crowd. Among them were senior officials from the police department, representatives from internal affairs, an attorney from the state prosecutor's office, members of court security leadership, and federal marshals whose presence alone signaled that this situation had escalated far beyond anything routine. Kane watched the arrival with a slowly dawning sense of unease, his earlier confidence beginning to crack as he registered just how many high-ranking individuals had suddenly converged on a single sidewalk arrest. He glanced toward Devon, searching for some reassurance, but his partner's expression offered none, eyes wide, posture stiff, clearly recognizing the same warning signs Kane himself was only beginning to process. The crowd parted instinctively as the police chief stepped forward, his pace deliberate, his expression unreadable, moving directly past Kane without so much as a glance in his direction. "Your Honor," the chief said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent plaza as he addressed Lila directly. "Are you all right?" The two words, "Your Honor," struck the crowd like a physical force, confirming in an instant everything the whispers had already suggested. Kane felt the blood drain from his face, the full weight of the title landing with the precision of a verdict already decided. For the first time since the encounter, doubt crept into his expression, replacing the earlier certainty with something closer to dawning horror. Lila answered calmly, despite the handcuffs still binding her wrists, her composure unwavering even now. "I'm fine," she said simply, "though I would appreciate these being removed." The chief turned immediately, his voice sharp with command as he ordered another officer to release her at once. The sound of the cuffs unlocking echoed through the plaza like a small symbolic undoing of everything Kane had set into motion. The crowd, watching in stunned silence, seemed collectively to exhale, releasing tension that had built steadily since the first accusation was hurled. Kane attempted to speak, stumbling over a half-formed explanation about following procedure, about reasonable suspicion, about simply doing his job as he understood it. No one acknowledged him. The internal affairs representative did not look in his direction. The federal marshals exchanged brief, clipped words with court security, already coordinating next steps that clearly did not include hearing Kane's side of the story just yet. It was, perhaps, the loneliest moment of his entire career, standing surrounded by colleagues and superiors who had all, in the span of a few seconds, decided he no longer mattered to the conversation taking place. Lila rubbed her wrists gently once freed, glancing briefly at the gathered officials before turning her attention to the crowd that had witnessed everything from beginning to end. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at watching Kane unravel in real time, only the same steady calm that had carried her through the entire ordeal. Whatever came next, she seemed to understand, would not require her to raise her voice even once, because the truth, properly examined, rarely needed defending by the person it had already vindicated. Investigators gathered every piece of available footage, treating the courthouse plaza as something closer to a crime scene than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. Body cam recordings were pulled directly from Kane's uniform and from Devon Hale's as well, synced carefully against timestamps to construct a complete, unbroken record of the encounter. Street cameras positioned along the courthouse perimeter offered additional angles, capturing details the officer's own equipment had missed, including the exact moment Kane dismissed the registration without ever truly examining it. Court security footage added yet another layer, showing the crowd's reaction building steadily from curiosity into open concern well before the handcuffs ever appeared. Investigators cross-referenced this material against the dozens of live streams and recordings already circulating among bystanders, each version telling essentially the same story from a slightly different vantage point. Kane mocking, suspicious without cause, dismissive of documentation, escalating a routine stop into something far more serious based entirely on assumptions formed before a single word had been exchanged. An attorney representing the city arrived as well, standing quietly to one side as internal affairs began their preliminary review, fully aware that whatever legal exposure existed here would only grow larger the longer the footage circulated unanswered. Investigators sat Kane down in a small administrative office inside the courthouse. The contrast between that quiet, sterile room and the chaos of the plaza outside was almost unbearable in its silence. "Why didn't you verify the vehicle identification number before escalating this stop?" one investigator asked directly, her tone neither hostile nor sympathetic, simply factual. Kane struggled to answer, offering fragments of justification that crumbled the moment they left his mouth. He mentioned instinct. He mentioned experience. He mentioned a pattern he claimed to have noticed over years on patrol. Though when pressed for specific examples, his explanations grew increasingly vague and increasingly difficult to defend. The investigator made careful notes, her expression giving nothing away, though everyone in that room understood exactly how thin his reasoning sounded once stripped of the confidence that had carried him through the original confrontation. Outside the courthouse, the footage had already spread far beyond the initial crowd of bystanders, shared and reshared until it reached corners of the city that had no direct connection to the plaza at all. Strangers who had never met Lila Monroe found themselves drawn to her composure, her patience, the simple dignity with which she had endured something no one should ever have to endure. Equally, strangers who had never met Travis Kane found themselves dissecting his every word, his posture, his dismissive laughter, building a portrait of someone whose actions seemed to confirm exactly the kind of bias many had long suspected operated quietly beneath the surface of supposedly routine policing. The story had taken on a momentum no single person could control or contain, moving through the city with the kind of speed that made traditional investigations feel almost quaint by comparison. The footage was undeniable, consistent across every angle, leaving no room for the kind of conflicting accounts that so often allowed similar incidents to fade quietly without consequence. For Kane, sitting alone in that small administrative office while his career hung in increasingly fragile balance, the absence of any defense beyond his own word had never felt more dangerous. As the investigation deepened, internal affairs began pulling Kane's complete personnel file, a thick stack of documents that told a story far older than the events of that single confrontation. Buried within years of routine evaluations and commendations were several complaints that had been filed over the preceding decade, each one involving accusations of excessive authority during traffic stops, the majority directed at drivers of expensive vehicles who happened to be people of color. None of these complaints had ever resulted in serious consequences, each one quietly closed, dismissed, or settled without any lasting mark on his record. A pattern emerged with uncomfortable clarity once investigators laid the complaints side by side. Dates spanning multiple years, locations scattered across different parts of the city, yet the underlying behavior strikingly consistent each time. A businessman driving a luxury sedan stopped without clear cause. A young executive detained over a registration that later proved entirely legitimate. A retired physician questioned aggressively despite producing every requested document within the first minute of the encounter. Each case, examined individually, had seemed minor enough to overlook. Together, they painted a picture that no one within the department could continue pretending not to see. Previously, these complaints had lacked the kind of undeniable evidence necessary to force real accountability, often reduced to conflicting accounts between officer and civilian with no clear way to determine the truth. This time, circumstances had aligned differently. Cameras everywhere, witnesses by the dozens, a victim whose position and credibility made dismissal nearly impossible. The very visibility that Kane had perhaps assumed worked in his favor, given his badge and his authority, had instead become the mechanism through which his pattern of behavior was finally undeniably exposed to full scrutiny. Investigators interviewed Devin Hale separately, hoping to understand whether he had witnessed similar behavior from his partner in the past. Reluctantly, Devin admitted that he had noticed something uncomfortable building over the months they had worked together. Small comments, certain assumptions Kane seemed to make almost automatically whenever certain types of vehicles or certain types of people crossed his attention. "I should have said something sooner," Devin admitted quietly, his voice heavy with the kind of regret that comes from recognizing complicity only after the consequences had already become impossible to ignore. The city's legal department, meanwhile, began preparing for what now seemed an inevitable wave of public and possibly legal scrutiny, aware that the footage alone created significant liability regardless of how the internal investigation eventually concluded. Conversations shifted quickly from whether Kane had acted improperly to how extensively the department itself had failed by allowing years of similar complaints to accumulate without meaningful intervention. For many watching the unfolding story from outside, this realization landed even harder than the original incident. The understanding that what had happened to Lila Monroe was not an isolated failure, but the visible surface of something far deeper and far more troubling. Even Kane's most sympathetic colleagues within the department found themselves struggling to offer any meaningful defense. The story no longer belonged solely to that single confrontation outside the courthouse. It belonged now to every overlooked complaint, every dismissed pattern, every moment when someone in a position to intervene had chosen silence instead of accountability. For those watching closely, the satisfaction of finally seeing consequences arrive felt tempered by the uncomfortable awareness of just how long those consequences had been delayed. A retired captain who had once supervised Kane early in his career was contacted for a brief statement, and his response, though guarded, carried its own quiet weight. "He was a good officer on paper," the captain said, "but paper never tells you what someone assumes the moment they see a certain face behind a certain wheel." The comment circulated quickly among investigators, less because it offered new evidence, and more because it captured almost perfectly the exact failure the department now found itself forced to confront. Years of looking only at the paper, never at the pattern underneath it, had allowed exactly this outcome to remain possible for far too long. Throughout the entire ordeal, Lila Monroe conducted herself with a restraint that surprised even those who knew her well, declining every opportunity to transform her experience into something louder or more vindictive than it needed to be. When reporters approached, eager for a statement dripping with outrage or condemnation, she offered instead a measure. Rain fell in thin gray sheets over the parking lot outside the pharmacy. Under the flickering streetlight, a woman in a plain dark coat stepped out with a small paper bag in her hand. 3 patrol cars converged before she reached the corner, tires hissing against wet asphalt, headlights sweeping across storefront glass. 3 officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, eyes narrow with a suspicion that had no evidence behind it and never would. Within seconds, she was pressed against the hood of a cruiser, her cheek against cold, wet metal, because she looked, in their words, like someone worth stopping. A crowd gathered under umbrellas, phones raised, capturing every second, while one officer smiled the way men smile when they believe consequences belong to other people. The woman said nothing unkind. She simply waited, calm as still water, while the cold cuffs closed around her wrists. Then, once the metal clicked shut, she asked permission to reach into her coat, slow and deliberate, giving no one a reason to panic. She pulled out a small leather case, opened it without hurry, and let a gold badge catch the streetlight for every phone camera to see. The smiles disappeared instantly, replaced by something closer to dread. None of the 3 officers standing in that rain understood yet that their entire department had just entered its final hours, and that the woman they had humiliated on a public sidewalk had been sent there for exactly this moment. Her name was Serena Vaughn, a black woman who carried herself like someone who had learned long ago that stillness could be its own kind of power. She worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Civil Rights Division, where her job was to find corruption hiding inside the very institutions built to prevent it. She rarely raised her voice, and she rarely needed to, because she had learned that silence, held long enough, made other people talk first. Colleagues described her as a woman who listened twice as much as she spoke, who noticed details other people walked past without seeing, who could sit in a room full of noise and still hear the one voice that mattered. She had spent years studying patterns of misconduct inside police departments scattered across the South, watching how power, left unchecked, tended to curdle into cruelty over time. She had walked into dozens of cities exactly like this one before, cities with tidy courthouse squares and magnolia trees, and a police department everyone quietly feared but rarely discussed out loud. She did not enjoy the work exactly, but she understood its necessity, the way a surgeon understands the necessity of a difficult incision. Somewhere behind her calm exterior lived the memory of every complaint she had ever read, every name attached to a story nobody in power wanted to hear. The city where she now stood was a mid-sized town, the kind with old brick storefronts, a courthouse square that still smelled faintly of magnolia in the evenings, and a police department with a reputation whispered about more than written down. That reputation described a force that was heavy-handed with anyone who did not look like the men who ran it. A force that treated certain neighborhoods as territory to be controlled rather than communities to be served. Arrest records, once pulled and analyzed, showed black residents stopped and searched at a rate nearly 4 times higher than white residents in those same neighborhoods year after year, with no explanation offered and none demanded. Complaints had been filed for years, dozens of them, each one closed with the same 3 words stamped neatly across the folder. Unfounded, insufficient evidence, case closed. Nobody outside the department seemed to ask why the pattern never changed, no matter how many names filled the complaint box, no matter how many families showed up at council meetings only to be thanked politely and dismissed. The mayor's office issued statements about ongoing reviews that never seemed to conclude. Local reporters wrote stories that ran once and disappeared. The department had learned over years of practice exactly how much scrutiny it could absorb without ever having to change, and it had grown comfortable inside that margin. Serena arrived in the city under the quiet cover of a legal conference, her name printed neatly on a laminated badge that said nothing about her real assignment. She checked into a modest hotel 3 blocks from the courthouse, attended panels on constitutional law and evidentiary procedure, nodded politely at strangers who had no idea what she carried folded inside her briefcase. Nobody in that city knew her actual purpose. Not the hotel clerk who handed her a room key, not the panel moderator who thanked her for a thoughtful question, not even the police officers whose paths she would soon cross beneath a streetlight. She had been sent quietly, deliberately, to observe a department that had spent months under a federal microscope without ever once suspecting it. Before the conference, Serena had spent time at the federal field office 2 counties away, reviewing surveillance logs with a small team assembled specifically for this assignment. A data analyst named Elise Thornton had spread years of traffic stop records across a conference table, color-coded by neighborhood, by shift, by the badge number of the officer who signed each report. The pattern had been undeniable even before Serena arrived in the city. But patterns on paper rarely moved a courtroom the way footage did, and everyone in that room understood the difference between a statistic and a witness. A supervisor named Dominic Reyes had briefed her one final time before she checked into the hotel, reminding her that nothing about this assignment required her to provoke anything, only to exist in the city long enough for whatever was already happening there to happen to her, too. She had nodded, gathered her bag, and told him she had done this kind of quiet waiting before in cities that looked almost exactly like this one. Meanwhile, across town, the night patrol shift prepared for another ordinary evening, unaware that ordinary was about to end for all of them before the night was through. At the center of that shift stood Officer Harlan Voss, a man built from confidence and habit in equal measure, the kind of officer who mistook authority for infallibility and had never once been forced to learn the difference. Voss had worked the streets for years, decorated twice for bravery, reprimanded rarely and never seriously, and never once in his own mind wrong about anything that mattered. He believed instinct was evidence enough to justify almost any action he chose to take. He believed a raised eyebrow, a certain posture, a certain kind of walk down a certain kind of street justified a stop, a search, a demand for identification. His colleagues respected him the way people respect anything loud enough to drown out doubt. And beneath that respect sat a quieter truth nobody dared say aloud in the locker room or the break room. This was not one bad night waiting to happen to one unlucky woman. This was a culture built brick by brick, shift by shift, complaint by dismissed complaint, until it became load-bearing in every corner of the department. Younger officers learned it from older ones, absorbing the unspoken rules the way apprentices absorb a trade, until suspicion itself became a kind of muscle memory nobody thought to question. The conference ended in the evening, and Serena walked the several blocks back toward her hotel beneath a sky heavy with rain that had not yet fallen. She wore a dark coat against the evening chill, carried a leather bag over one shoulder, and kept her stride even and unhurried the way she always did after a long day spent listening to other people's certainty. She wore no makeup beyond what she needed for a professional room full of strangers, and nothing about her appearance suggested anything other than a tired attorney heading home after a long conference session. From 2 blocks away, half hidden in the shadow of a parked delivery truck, Harlan Voss watched her walk past a darkened storefront, and something in his gut, the same gut that had failed him before without consequence, told him she did not belong there. "She's suspicious," he said into his radio, though nothing about her matched any description on record that night. Nothing about her posture or pace suggested anything but a woman eager to reach a warm hotel room. No call had come in reporting a crime in progress. No witness had described a suspect matching her clothing or her build. No lookout bulletin mentioned a woman in a dark coat walking briskly through a downtown sidewalk after a legal conference. There was only a feeling dressed up as instinct, dressed up as policing, and Voss trusted that feeling the way he always had because it had never once been challenged before this exact night. The patrol car swung around the block, tires hissing against wet asphalt, and pulled alongside her with its lights spinning red and blue against the storefront glass. Serena stopped walking the moment the lights hit her, because she understood better than almost anyone standing on that street exactly how these moments could end if handled wrong. She had watched footage of encounters that ended badly, for reasons no more substantial than the one unfolding around her now. The officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters, voices sharp with commands before a single question had been asked or a single crime named. "Raise your hands, open the bag. Where is your identification?" She complied with each instruction, slow and deliberate, offering her hands first, opening the bag herself so no one could later claim she had resisted or reached for something dangerous. Voss searched through the bag anyway, pulling out papers, a phone, a set of keys, turning each item over as though something incriminating might fall out if he shook it hard enough. A small crowd began to gather on the far sidewalk beneath awnings and umbrellas, phones rising one by one to record what was unfolding beneath the streetlight. A man walking his dog stopped to watch. A woman leaving a late shift at a diner slowed her steps, phone already raised. Nobody intervened because nobody ever did in moments like this. But nobody looked away either. The search turned into something closer to theater. Voss narrated his suspicions aloud for the benefit of no one and everyone at once. He raised his voice louder than the moment required, the kind of volume meant to perform authority rather than simply assert it. He used words that carried more insinuation than accusation, calling her evasive when she answered plainly, calling her defensive when she stood still and said nothing at all. A younger officer standing near the second cruiser hesitated, his hand hovering uncertainly near his belt, his eyes flicking between Voss and the woman he did not seem entirely convinced was dangerous. His name, though nobody in the crowd knew it yet, was Elias Crow, still relatively new to the job and still young enough to notice when something felt wrong. Voss caught the hesitation in his rookie's face and crushed it instantly, the way he had crushed every small doubt that had ever threatened his authority on a street corner. "Cuff her," he said, flat and final, the kind of order that left no room for a rookie's uncertainty to grow into a question. Elias hesitated only a fraction of a second longer before reaching for his own cuffs, his movement stiff, his jaw tight, the muscles in his hands betraying a reluctance his mouth was too afraid to voice out loud. Serena asked the only question that actually mattered in that moment. "Am I under arrest?" "Vostia," she answered without looking at her directly, already reaching for the cuffs at his own belt as though the